This week's build was months in the making. There was a bit of a gap in between, because for once I wasn't doing the build by myself.
Hi, I'm Seb, and I make stuff. And I'm here with Cody from Of Dice and Magic, and we're gonna make some awesome stuff to go into his D&D podcast.
The inspiration for this build came from a pile of Halloween bones and a misprinted dice tower. So I started with a sketch, and I think we'll be working on the head section, but I gotta run it by Cody first and see what he thinks.
Part of what I was thinking is, well, it would be cool to have like, if we build up like a rock formation around this, so you could even have like a house on something here, rocks here, like they've built it, or like this is the way you go up through here, steps in there, and like you imagine that you go through the skull, to come out.
Like a ladder?
And that's how you get into the house, which is like the main base area.
Yeah, that's cool.
Because what I reckon is a cool idea is to think like it's a reef, so there's all these big jutting rocks, and that's where the giant has died, and that's why it's not completely sunk into the ocean or something. You know?
Yeah.
So it's on this rock formation in the ocean.
That's cool.
We cut out a couple of just random, shapes that we can use to build the rocks off of or whatever, so they can sit on a land mass that could be grass or whatever if you wanted, or they could sit on a seaboard. So you could put it in any situation.
Yes.
Then it becomes a couple of scatter pieces.
Because that's what you want, something you can use multiple times.
Yeah.
Yes, good call. I think that'll be the way to go.
Essentially, yeah.
And now that we're on the same page, it was time to start the build. So first thing, we started to use some pieces of foam to build out the basic shape of our land masses, before marking out and cutting out the wood that will be our base pieces.
Damn.
Like that. Thought that was going to be a bit harder. So now we can just...
Damn. I guess you can just snap it.
We're coming at this pretty rough since we can clean it up later, and it will be largely covered with the expanding foam that's going to be used to build up our rocks. Ideally we'd be using a jigsaw, but I don't have one of those, so this will have to do for now.
As long as it's going to keep the bottom flat.
It's big bit. This is headpiece.
And now we just line these bits and pieces up with a few other 3D printed builds that we want to fit on the final piece to make sure that everything sits nicely.
You can see that there is something around the back if they want to go around there.
Yeah, that's cool.
And there's heaps of like jutting rocks, and we'll put a heap of spray foam around the base of this. We grab a couple of knives and we carve a couple of big rocks to come out the back, stick these basic shapes in, and then just smash this with expanding foam. Love with rock because you can just go as harsh and rough as you want, and it can all make sense. The rougher, the better.
Look, I await the day that they find a perfectly round rock.
Now we're going to be experimenting with expanding foam. This is going to be interesting. Maybe we should carve up the others, sort of figure out what we want to do with the second base as well, so we can do them both at once.
Yes, I think that'd be a good call.
So, the good thing about the expanding foam is it's going to fill in a heap of gaps, so we can kind of use anything to base.
But the running idea with all the terrain pieces that Seb has helped make for the podcast so far is we try to invoke a challenge or an idea for the players to think of clever and unique ways to traverse the terrain. Whether they want to run the long way and go safely through the gangways to see if they're going to make it, or if they want to run the risk to make athletics checks or dexterity checks to jump to make it across the things. So it's a very unique way to go. I think that looks cool.
I already like that.
It's these packing foam. Keep your packing foam.
Absolutely. I'm going to get a hot glue gun so we can stick these
Just get them on
roughly in the shape we want them, so that the expanding foam doesn't push stuff around.
And so we get the hot glue gun ready, and just start liberally applying it to all of the foam and sticking it down anywhere that you think looks cool. The more random that this goes down, the better, as it's gonna end up holding together the expanding foam that we'll put down shortly. And this stuff doesn't like to stick to the wood too easily. So we just want a whole heap of gaps and crevices and have it all hot glued down to the base. And once we're finished with this one, we'll come back to the main skeletal head, and repeat the process, using a whole batch of hot glue to hold everything down in place roughly where we want it. Also making sure to bring out any of the 3D printed pieces that we want on the final build to measure out the spacing and make sure that everything's going to fit together on the final piece. And then a lot more gluing. The best part about making natural rock formations is that there's no wrong answers. Nature tends to do whatever it wants, and so can you. Just keep sticking down foam wherever you like the look of it and cutting away anything that looks too straight and unnatural. A lot of this will be getting covered up with expanding foam to add an even more random feel, but we still don't want to leave too many flat edges. Except for the flat tops where we want to be able to put down some 3D prints and we want miniatures to be able to stand. Now we're happy, it's time to bust out the expanding foam. Now I've worked with this stuff a long time ago. Essentially, I'm just going to start filling in all of the gaps. This stuff will squeeze out nicely and get in nice and deep, and it should grow to be about 3 times the size of when you first put it down. So be careful not to apply too much into these areas, as it does tend to expand quite a lot. And once you've got a good amount of the expanding foam down, giving it a nice random rocky texture, you can start pulling it around if you want to have a bit more specific of a shape, or if you just want to open up some areas like we want through this center crevice. Now that we're happy with the first base, it's time to move on to the second one and just fill this out with everything we've got left, as whatever you don't use tends to get stuck in the nozzle and you're probably not going to get a lot of use out of this again. So once we've got the areas that we want covered, I'm just going to come back into our original base and use up everything else in the can. These cans are fairly cheap, so it's not really a big deal to go through a whole batch in one go, but we really do want this final result to look awesome, so I'm making sure to cover up anywhere that has an unnatural edge. And once we're happy with everything being down, it's time to leave it for a few hours to dry. So we threw it out in the sun to speed up the process a little bit and came back to check on it before adding a layer of the Black Magic Craft MogPodge mix. This is just MogPodge mixed with black paint and is used to seal everything up before we come in with some rattle cans, as they have a tendency to melt away the foam and we don't want to destroy all of our hard work. And while the first bit of this is drying, I'm going to add some texture with a shaker full of dirt. This should stick to the MogPodge and be a great base before we come in with our first aerosol paint. I'm using a Granite effect paint to try and bring in that nice random rock feel that you get on sea rock. I'm able to safely spray this onto the expanding foam as it won't melt away, but I'm making sure that I've covered up all of the areas of the original packing foam that we want to keep in their initial shape. My only problem with this was that it didn't tend to change the colour of the expanding foam quite enough. So I grabbed a cheap grey primer and started to give everything a basic light coat in that where we'd missed the original foam. Before coming back in with that Granite effects paint and giving everything a super heavy coat. I love the randomness that this applies, and it really helps bring that sea rock feel to life with as much random textures and colours as we can possibly get on this build. And then to blend this all together, I gave it a super light spritz with the original grey primer once again. And while we've been working on this, I've also been printing off a few accessory pieces. These come from the Hagglethorn Hollow set and are perfect for this kind of build. I printed these ones out on my resin printer, allowed them some time to cure in the sun, and then painted them up with a grey primer. The next step is to give them all a spray in a Tamiya Colors NATO Brown spray paint, in addition to this pile of other 3D printed parts that we're going to be using to really spice up this build. I love this spray paint from Tamiya as it has a really nice matte finish, whereas a lot of the other brown spray paints that I can come across end up with a satin or a gloss finish, which just doesn't quite work for that wood texture in my opinion. And now that we have all of our accessories with their base paint layer, it's time to figure out how we want them to go onto the build. So we spent a little bit of time playing around with all of these prints, figuring out the best way to make this board as playable as possible while still looking dope.
Like that, like, yes. That looks kind of cool, yeah. Those two in here.
Also pulling out a few other little bits and pieces of 3D printed materials to fill in a few extra details, like these stacking stones to give it a slightly lived in and more mystical feel. Now before we start gluing down all of these wooden pieces, it's time to bust out the towel white ochre and give them all a dry brush. In my opinion, this is the perfect way to bring that realistic wooden look onto any of these 3D prints, rather than just having one thick coat of a single type of brown. And once they're all ready, it's time to bust out the hot glue gun again and start sticking everything in place. I'm then using a bit of extra hot glue to really fill in the gaps and seal this down, that we plan on painting over later anyway to help blend everything together. So we just start going around, grabbing out pieces of wood and placing them where we think they look best. Occasionally having to tear away a little bit of the original foam to help things to sit flat, but this is fine because we're going to cover that up anyway.
Good save.
And once we're happy with this first piece, it's time to move on and do the same to the secondary piece. So we just start piling on the hot glue and sticking down the wooden plankways wherever we think looks good, but also trying to think about what would be practical use for the monsters that have built this ramshackle base. And with our final piece glued down, it's time to start covering up all of that hot glue so it doesn't look too weird amongst our build. For this, we're going to be going over everything with a texture paint. This grey mud is great and it's going to blend in nicely to the rest of our build, as well as covering up all of those super clean edges that the hot glue tends to leave on our builds. The other advantage is that we can really pile this on thick to help fill in any gaps that we feel have been left behind. Additionally, I'll come back in and dry brush a bit of this over the rest of the model to help blend all of these areas together and have them make a little bit more sense, making it less obvious that this is just a cover-up job. Now we're going to spray paint a whole heap of toothpicks and skewers. These are going to be used as our basing beams for all of our wooden planks. So we just start cutting them down to size and sticking them in place to hold up all of our baseboards. And we really just came at this part of the build with as much randomness as we possibly could. The concept behind this is that it's been thrown together by goblins and they tend not to have the best systems of craft. So anything that looks like it would just help hold it up, whether it's logical or not. Honestly, that's the most fun about a fantasy build. None of it really needs to make a whole lot of sense as long as it looks cool. And in this case, all of these extra bits and pieces jutting out and holding up our walkways and planks really does look quite cool. It's some fiddly work and there is a lot of it to do, so we busted out a couple of pairs of tweezers and the two of us got to work at the same time, adding as much of these supports as we could until it felt like something the goblins were thrown together. And then it was time to start adding in some life. We threw down some MogPodge around some of the edges, especially sort of focusing around the rock areas where grasses and dirts would have been caught in the wind. We chose to only put some sparse areas of grass and life on this board, so that it would feel like it could belong on just about any piece of terrain, whether we have this out in the middle of the ocean or sitting in the middle of a large grass field. No matter where you are, there will be some kind of life growing, unless you're deep underground. And even then, in a fantasy world, there's always room to throw a few extra weird weeds that your herbalists might be able to pull some bits and pieces from. So we came through with more tufts to add a bit more variation than just the static grasses and phlox, and then even added a few flowers, really popping out against the dead rock and the giant skull. And with that final detail, we've got our build complete.
Alright, so 3 months in the making, we've finally got it back together and finished the build. This thing is... Yeah, we went extra on this one.
We were a bit hand-bone.
And it was a lot of fun working with someone else.
Yeah.
So actually building and crafting together rather than just sitting by myself in a dark room made for a much more fun experience. This has been an awesome build, guys. You should definitely check out the existing stuff that Cody's done over at Dice and Magic, and he's got a whole new world coming soon that this will probably be a part of. I'm ecstatic. This has been brilliant and kind of creepy. We've done a lot of little details, so we've added a little bit of garden, we've thrown in these piling stones and really gone to town adding the supporting structures to make this really look fantasy and lived in. It's actually been a pretty easy build. Some basic expanding foam, spray paints, and sand was
MDF basing to keep it nice and rigid, with the concept of being able to take off a lot of the extra flary bits to make it, such as the tower. A lot of your walkways are glued in, but when you start removing a lot of the excess stuff, we have some statues on the back here, it becomes a very plain system, which means you can reuse it on multiple occasions. If you're someone like me that has a recurring campaign where you go back to the same places, it's good to be able to go back and visit and change the tower. There might be some money shots where the tower is the destroyed version of the tower.
Again, using the Hagglethorn hollow buildings that I've used in a couple of my other builds lately, you can see that a bit of variation can really change the board up a lot.
If you follow my Instagram for our podcast of Dice and Magic, we're going to be coming back after Christmas, which is going to be great. In the meantime, I am currently helping my player and cousin Sky produce her all-female group D&D podcast, which is called Dungeons and Nerdettes. So Dungeons _and_Nerdettes. Brilliant role play. The characters are great. The gals play phenomenal. Getting to sit in on that and be a part of it has just been fantastic. Through the ODAM channels, we'll announce the new group, the new podcast, and what we're going to do with that. And yeah, it's going to be cool. We're getting very spooky. It's going to be very spooky. It's going to be great.
I'm looking forward to that one because I might even make an appearance.
Yeah, more than one. You're mine now. You're mine now.
Well, guys, I hope you've liked what we've put together today, and it's been a lot of fun working with someone else.
Yeah, bud.
And until next time, never stop making stuff.